Okay, so now we're going to move on to our historical overview of Judaism. And Judaism starts with a single individual who's known as the first patriarch of Judaism. So Abraham is the first patriarch. So he's the first sort of, you could say, head or leader of Judaism. We don't necessarily say that Abraham is the founder of Judaism. You wouldn't necessarily hear that type of vocabulary, that type of term applied to Abraham, because the story of the beginning of Judaism is not a story about Abraham, having a new teaching or new wisdom or new insight to teach to others. Abraham is someone, as we'll see it in the reading, Abraham is someone who simply responds to the call of God. So that's why the term patriarch is normally used for Abraham, as well as several others of the first sort of central leaders or individuals that guide Judaism in the first phase of its history. So the story of Abraham comes from the Torah, which is the Hebrew Bible, the sacred text of Judaism. And according to the story, Abraham actually wasn't named Abraham first. His name was Abram. And Abram is a man who lives in Ur, which is an area that now is present-day Iraq. And so Abraham is going about his life. He's married. He has a trade. And one day he has an experience of God. He has an encounter with God. And God asks Abram to follow him. Says, I will be your God, I am God, and I want you to follow me. I want you to obey me and literally follow me. I want you to leave your home. I want you to leave everyone you know, all your possessions, and come and follow me. I will show you where to go. I will lead you into a new land that I have in store for you. So Abraham has this encounter, this experience with God. God asks him to do these things, and Abram says yes, right? He responds to the call of God. He obeys God. So this is the beginning of Judaism, Abram's response or obedience to God, not Abram's necessarily teachings about God. So that's why he doesn't quite fit into the category of a founder of a religious tradition. So Abram leaves home. He goes with his wife Sarah, and her name at this point is Sarai. And they say, yes, God, we will follow you. We're leaving everything behind. We're going out into the desert. We are going to become basically wandering nomads, and we will do what you say. We will follow your guidance, and we will follow your instructions for us. Because they are leaving home and really becoming new people and new identities in this relationship with God, they're given new names. So Abram becomes Abraham, and Sarai becomes Sarah. So Abraham and Sarah are the first patriarch and matriarch of Judaism. And this relationship has a special name and a special understanding. The name of this relationship is the covenant. So Abram, and who's now Abraham, doesn't just agree to do whatever God says for nothing in return, let's say. Abraham and God start a covenant. And the word covenant is really just a fancy word for contract. So a contract is made between Abraham and God. So remember, God asks Abram for his obedience, right? He says, I want you to worship me, and I want you to obey me because I am God. And Abram agrees to do this and becomes Abraham. So Abraham's part of the covenant, his side of this contract, is to love God, worship God, and obey God, and to not worship any other gods. So this is a culture, this is a time in which there are lots of different gods and goddesses that are worshipped. Most people are members of a tribe, and that tribe has their own gods and goddesses. So most people were polytheistic. So one thing that God was asking of Abraham is to reject all those other gods except me, right? I'm going to be your only God. I am capital G God. Abraham, right, he agrees. This is his side of the covenant. But God promises something in return. God is not just saying, I want you to do these things because I am God. He says, I want you to do these things because I am God, and I will give you several things in return. So the covenant is a very special relationship because God is also part of this contract. God has certain promises that he has to fulfill over time in the tradition of Judaism. So the first thing that God promises Abraham is children and descendants. Abram and Sarai didn't have any children. They were quite elderly when this happened to them. They had no children yet. They had always wanted children, but it just didn't happen for them. So God promises Abram, you will have many children, and of those children, they will become a great nation, right? You will have so many descendants. You will become the patriarch of a large family. And this is, of course, something very exciting to Abraham and Sarah. So God promises him children and many descendants. He also promises him land. Right? He says, I want you to leave your homeland. I want you to leave everything behind. But I am going to provide you with new land. I'm going to provide you with a new home. So if you follow me, I'm not just, taking you around in circles. I am going to show you into a promised land and to your descendants into a promised land. So he promises children. He promises land. And then the last promise is really like a special relationship and the protection of God. So he says, if you do these things, I will maintain this close relationship with you. I will look out for you and your descendants, your children, and I will give you my protection and my guidance. So this is the basics of the covenant. It starts with Abraham and God. It's this contract between Abraham and God. Abraham promises love, worship, and obedience, and God promises descendants, land, and a special relationship with Abraham. This covenant starts with Abraham, but it is renewed and expanded several times in the history of Judaism, and the covenantal relationship is understood by Jews to still be going on today. This is a continued contract. The terms are very similar to the ones that Abraham and God entered into. But this is the origin of the covenant, so it's important to know how this special relationship starts. Then I have here that there are 3 different phases in the history of Judaism. The idea of the covenant remains steady and the same over the history of Judaism. But how Judaism has looked as a practice and as a community has changed significantly over its history. Judaism has been around for a very long time. I forgot to mention Abraham's dates. We have 2 kind of contested dates for him. You could say the traditional theological understanding of when Abraham lived was around 1800 BCE. So many Jewish as well as Christian scholars understand Abraham to have lived around 1800 BCE. Outsiders, scholars of religion, historians, archaeologists, believe that due to the descriptions of, sort of the lifestyle of Abraham, certain items, that are mentioned in the scriptures, that he probably lived closer to 1200 BCE. So we're not going to, just say which one is correct or incorrect, but just to know that Abraham lived sometime between 1800 and 1200 BCE. That is the range of when theologians and scholars think that this individual likely lived. But we don't necessarily have that much historical evidence for the life of Abraham. The only texts we have about him are from the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. So we don't know conclusively if he was a historical person that lived, but if he did, those are that's the range of when he likely lived. So back to the 3 phases of Judaism. There have been 3 major ways in which the Jewish people have lived and organized themselves. So after Abraham responds to the call of God, the Jewish people basically live as wandering nomads for the first phase. So the first phase of Judaism is that this is a tribe. It is a group of people who live together in the Middle East. They don't have a settled homeland. that promised land that God promised Abraham doesn't come really until the second phase of Judaism. So for a very long time, the Jewish people do not have a homeland. Abraham actually never sees this, right? It doesn't happen until much, much after his own lifetime. So during this first phase, they are an extended family. They are a tribe of people, oftentimes known as the Hebrews or the Hebrew people or the Hebrew tribe. Usually that term is used as sort of to distinguish that phase of time of the Jewish people or the Jewish religion. At that time, as I mentioned, they live together. They are a tribal people. They are nomadic. They wander around the Middle East. They live in many different areas in the Middle East, most notably Egypt, which we'll talk about the stories that come out of their time in Egypt. And they understand God to live with them. So the God of Abraham, the Jewish God, is actually understood to be a spirit that dwells with the Hebrew people. So where they go, where they travel, God is always with them. God is living among them and guiding over them, right? Having that protective relationship with them. So there are many important stories that come out of this first phase of Judaism. Stories like the Exodus that we'll talk about, some other very important stories as this period of time is well documented in the Hebrew Bible. Then eventually the Jewish people or the Hebrew people do get their promised land. So at a certain point, God does lead them into a particular land that is called Canaan, is called Palestine, today is called Israel. And the Hebrew people conquer that land. They conquer the local tribes and they take control of that land. So there is a brief period of time that they are given this promised land and they are in control of this land. During this time, they build a temple. So the image above me is actually an artistic recreation of, I think this is actually the second temple. So they do build a temple, which is the center of their religion. That temple is destroyed, and a second temple is built, and then later on we'll talk about the second temple being destroyed. But this period of time that spans the first and second temple is known as temple-based Judaism. So for several hundred years, from about 1000 BCE to about 70 CE, the Jewish people have a central place of worship. They have a central building where they believe the Spirit of God lives. Right? So this temple is very important for Judaism because God is understood to actually live there. That's where God lives, in this building that you can see the likely recreation of behind me. And so Judaism is tied to a certain place and it's tied to a certain land. If you want to engage in the Jewish religion, you go to this temple. You travel to this temple, whether you live near or far, because that's where God is. And this phase of Judaism has certain leaders. So during this time, Judaism has priests. You've probably heard of a rabbi today, but at this time, there were not, the central leadership role was not necessarily the rabbi, it was the priest. And a priest worked at the temple, and the priest oversaw the central religious practice of temple-based Judaism, which was animal sacrifices. This was something that was commonplace during temple-based Judaism, but is not any longer a part of Judaism. If you're familiar with the Hebrew Bible, you're probably well aware of this. This is something that's talked about a lot in the Hebrew Bible, the sacred text of Judaism. So if you did something that would offend God, if you did something that would anger God, you had something very specific to do to gain God's favor back. You would go to the temple, you would buy an animal, and the temple had lots of, stalls, people around the temple that would sell animals. You would take the animal to the temple, you would pay a priest to sacrifice it and perform the proper ritual sacrifice, say the proper prayers, and that would be a way of asking for God's forgiveness and receiving God's forgiveness through that act. So temple-based Judaism, it's important to know that it is tied to a certain land. It's tied to the land of Israel. It's tied to this central temple, this central house of worship. and it engages in religious practices that are no longer a part of Judaism. The third phase in the history of Judaism is that of a book-based religion. It goes from a temple-based religion to a book-based religion. And this happens after the destruction of the Second Temple. We'll talk more specifics about the construction of the First Temple, the destruction of that, the construction of the Second Temple, the destruction of that. But important to know that the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE. It was destroyed by the Romans. And after that time, there has never been a central temple in the history of Judaism. The temple has never been rebuilt, and there are many different views today within Judaism about whether or not another temple should be built, but it has never happened, and there's never been like sort of attempts to do that. So temple-based Judaism ended in 70 CE. After the temple was destroyed, many Jewish people did not feel comfortable living near the temple anymore because it was destroyed by the Romans, and it was destroyed as part of a crackdown against the Jewish people. There was a lot of prejudice and persecution towards the Jews by the Romans. So a lot of Jewish people started moving away from what they knew as Israel. This becomes what we'll talk about is called the diaspora, which we'll talk about. This basically means diaspora is a word that can be used in many different contexts, and it means basically a community of people moving en masse away from their homeland, moving into all different parts of the world. So this is what happens after the destruction of the Second Temple, is Jewish people start moving to North Africa, to Europe, farther into the Middle East. They move away from their homeland. They move away from what they know as Israel, what they know as the Promised Land. And technically, we're still living in the time of the diaspora. But anyways, in the time of the diaspora, Judaism no longer has a central place. Right? The temple is no longer there, and many Jews do not want to stay in their Promised Land because of the fear that they feel towards the ruling power, towards the Romans who are in charge there. So Judaism has to change yet again. Now it doesn't have a central place, it doesn't have a central land that it can access freely. So Judaism changes from being focused on one place or one building to being focused on one text. So this is the time that the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, begins to be compiled together. It had been written over several hundred years, stories about the period of time when the Hebrew people were wandering nomads, stories about the building of the temple, what happened at the temple. So all the stories from these various periods of time over hundreds of years are compiled into a single text, and that text becomes the Torah, which is the centerpiece of Jewish religious life today. So this becomes really the way you can have a core to your religious tradition, even though members of that tradition have moved all over the world, right? If I can't, if I move to North Africa or I move to Europe in order to feel safe and for my family and my community to feel safe, I can't visit that temple anymore. I can't visit the land on which that temple was. But if I have a book, if I have a central text, I can take that religion with me. I don't need to be able to travel to Israel, to the place of the temple, to feel a connection to my religion, because I have the text with me. My community has the text. We can come together around this, right? This can be our temple in a way. So Judaism really starts to focus on this single text, on the Torah, and the Torah, studying the Torah, singing the Torah, chanting the Torah, is still the center of Jewish life today. So we are still living in the phase of book-based Judaism, book-based religion. And we'll talk a lot more about the Torah, the writing of it, the contents of it, and how it's used in Jewish life today. But it is very, very important still. It's seen as a way of bringing the Jewish people together, even though Jews live all over the world now. So I kind of already talked about the diaspora. As I mentioned, we do still live in the diaspora, where Jewish people have spread out from Israel all over the world. And down here, so after that I have the Holocaust. This is, of course, another major event in the history of Judaism. The Holocaust is an event that happened in the 20th century. Most of you have studied it already, probably junior high, high school. You know a lot about the Holocaust already. This was a campaign during World War II to try to exterminate the Jewish people from the world. So the goal of the Holocaust, the goal was not realized. Even though millions and millions of Jews were killed, the goal was actually to rid the world of Jewish people and the Jewish religion, so that it would no longer be a living community. And even though it didn't accomplish that goal, thankfully, it did manage to drastically change Judaism. The Jewish community, attitudes towards Jewish religion, all of that are deeply, deeply influenced by the occurrence of the Holocaust. One thing is it changes really what Judaism looks like as a global religion. Even though there were, of course, Jews that survived the Holocaust in Europe, many of them who did survive didn't want to remain living in Europe. They did not feel safe there anymore. They did not feel like that was a place that they should continue rebuilding their communities after that occurrence. So most Jews moved to either the United States or to Israel, which we'll talk about in a second. So there are still some Jewish people that live in Europe, but really that population was decimated by both the campaigns and the killing of the Holocaust, as well as people after the end of World War II simply wanting to emigrate, to leave Europe, so that they could find another place in the world where they would probably feel safer. So it's changed really globally where and how Judaism is practiced. And we'll also see it has changed Jewish theology, because the God of Judaism is a God who has this special relationship with the Jewish people. The Jewish people are also called the chosen people, which we'll talk more about. But the occurrence of the Holocaust was understandably very difficult for many Jewish people to reconcile with their understanding of God. If God is wholly good and God cares deeply about the Jewish people, they are his people, and this covenantal relationship is still going on, how could God let something like this happen? Why did this happen? So wrestling with those questions has really been the focus of Jewish theology since that time. So we'll talk about how it has changed attitudes towards Judaism for many people and changed them in different ways. But the Holocaust, of course, is an incredibly important event in the history of Judaism. Then the last item I have down here is Israel. So another incredibly important event for the Jewish people was the recreation of the state of Israel. So Israel now exists as a modern nation ever since 1948. So since 1948, there has been a country in the world called Israel. That did not occur beforehand, not since that brief period of time that we mentioned that's recorded in the Hebrew Bible. When the Hebrew people came into their promised land, they conquered the people that lived there and they retained control. It didn't last very long. They were very quickly conquered themselves, and Jews that continued to live there lived under the rule of other empires. But the State of Israel was created in 1948. It was really created as a reaction to the Holocaust, that the global community, the UN, decided that there should be somewhere in the world that Jews could feel safe, that they no longer, felt that they would be safely protected under another government. So the creation of the State of Israel occurred in order to give Jews a homeland, that the Jewish people would have a homeland. It is the land that they consider historically to be their homeland, and that hopefully this would create a place where they would be safe, and the Holocaust could not happen again. Right? So it was also done as sort of a prevention measure to make sure that such a horrible occurrence like that could not happen again. There are many different views on the creation of the state of Israel and Israel's relations with its neighbors since then. We don't have time to go too much into that history, only to know that it was created by the UN, and it was seen as an incredible event for the Jewish people. Although we will talk about, when we get to our society dimension, some of the issues, social trends that are going on in Israel now, Israel's own struggles to understand itself in the world, to understand itself as a Jewish homeland, its relationships with its neighbors, and also what their Jewish identity means, especially because today in Israel, most Israelis are not religious. They are Jewish, but they don't follow the Jewish religion. So this idea of what does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean that our country is Jewish? Especially when most Israelis are not actually religious. They don't practice the Jewish religion, but still identify as Jewish. So we will talk a lot more about each of these things, but that's sort of a general historical overview of some of the main phases and events that have happened in the history of Judaism. Okay,